This past March, in a quiet, formal meeting room in Tokyo, far from the usual corridors of power in North America, a profound strategic shift began to unfold. It forces us to ask a question that for decades was simply unthinkable. What happens when one of America's closest allies begins to quietly plan for a future where Washington is no longer the center of its defense universe? Because in that room, Japan formally proposed a pathway for Canada to join the Global Combat Air Program, an advanced next-generation fighter jet project led by Japan, the UK, and Italy. This move contradicts a half-century of strategic alignment and the key to understanding this entire pivot. It begins with a seemingly innocuous invitation for Canada to gain observer status. And what that term truly signifies? Well, that is the first clue to unlocking everything. That clue is a two-word phrase, observer status, formally offered to Canada during that quiet March 6th meeting in Tokyo. Now, let's be very clear. On the surface, the term observer sounds intentionally underwhelming. It sounds like a consolation prize, a seat at the back of the room, not at the main table. For anyone expecting a dramatic treaty signing moment, this felt like a letdown. You get to watch, but you don't get to play. But this is where the quiet strategy begins to reveal itself. Because according to officials in both London and Tokyo, this status isn't passive at all. It was specifically designed to be a launch pad for long-term participation. It's the antechamber to the throne room. Think of it this way. It allows Canada to bypass the long, complex, and time-consuming process of enlarging the core partnership. It's a key that unlocks the front door, granting access to the one thing that truly matters at this stage, classified information. We are talking about project data, development timetables, and the industrial opportunities that come with them. This means that long before a single dollar is committed to manufacturing, Canadian engineers could be looking at the same advanced sensor fusion blueprints as their Japanese counterparts. They can begin to understand the architectural challenges and the industrial sweet spots years ahead of any other nation standing in line. It's the first concrete, foundational step in a 50-year plan for our industrial and military sovereignty, secured without the massive multi-billion-dollar initial cost. It's an incredibly shrewd move. But if you think the brilliance of this plan began with that invitation in Tokyo, you'd be mistaken. That March meeting wasn't the opening move. It was the public result of a much quieter, more fundamental decision made weeks earlier, a decision that actually made the Tokyo invitation possible in the first place. So, if the Tokyo meeting wasn't the opening move, what was? To understand how that door swung open so effortlessly in March, we have to rewind just a few weeks to late January, to a quiet room in Ottawa for a signing ceremony that almost no one noticed. Picture it. January 27th, 2025 says it's a standard government photo op. Muted lighting, flags, formal handshakes between Defense Minister David McGuinty and Japanese Ambassador Kanji Yamanouchi. The document they're signing has a profoundly bureaucratic title, the Agreement Concerning the Transfer of Defense Equipment and Technology, or ETTA. It barely made a ripple in the news cycle. It looked, for all the world, like just another piece of diplomatic paperwork filed away in a cabinet. But this was the entire game. That agreement was not a ceremonial handshake. It was infrastructure. It was the legal and industrial railway being laid down, quietly, that would make everything else possible. This binding framework created the legal rails for joint research and development, for co-production, and for the secure sharing of intellectual property. Without that agreement, the GCAP talks with Canada simply could not happen. Legally, the conversation is a non-starter. This is where the story shifts. The Tokyo meeting wasn't a spontaneous opportunity. It was the logical culmination of that carefully built infrastructure. When the Canadian delegation walked into that room in March, it wasn't an audition. It was an activation. The entire legal architecture was already in place, pre-approved, ready to go. The journey didn't begin in Tokyo. It simply arrived at its first public destination. But this level of deliberate, long-term planning raises an even more pressing question. What was the catalyst? What force was so powerful that it compelled Ottawa to execute this intricate, multi-year pivot with such quiet determination? This wasn't just a good idea. The truth is, Canada's hand was being forced by a deadline that wasn't political, but mechanical. A clock was ticking, set not by an election cycle, but by an unchangeable maintenance schedule. That unchangeable maintenance schedule centers on an airframe that has defined Canadian skies for a generation, the CF-18. Procured in the 1980s, these jets are now approaching the absolute end of their structural life. The ticking clock isn't a metaphor, it's a matter of metal fatigue. The hard deadline for their retirement is around 2032. This date is the first anchor point of our entire strategic problem. Now you might be thinking, what about the 88 new F-35s we've purchased? That is the correct question, and the answer is crucial. The F-35 is a vital piece of the puzzle, but it is not the entire solution. Its fleet will achieve full operational capability right between 2032 and 2034. This timing is perfect to bridge the gap left by the retiring CF-18s, ensuring our defenses don't go dark. However, the F-35 is a fifth-generation fighter. The real strategic question is not how we defend Canada in 2035, but how we secure our sovereign airspace in 2045, 2055, and beyond, when sixth-generation technology will dominate. Imagine a timeline of Canada's air defense capability. The CF-18 line ends abruptly here at 2032. The F-35 fleet appears, forming a solid block of capability through the 2030s. But then, look further out. Beyond 2040, a void begins to form. A vast empty space where our sovereign control of the skies becomes uncertain. This isn't a failure of planning. It's the moment of unavoidable truth that forced Ottawa to stop thinking in 10-year cycles and start architecting a 50-year framework. Faced with this impending capability gap, Canada had to find a sixth-generation partner. The options were starkly limited. The United States' own program, the NGAD, remains a black box, highly secretive, with no clear, structured pathway for allied co-development. On the other side of the Atlantic, the European FCAS program, led by France, Germany, and Spain, has been consistently mired in political and industrial disagreements, making it an unstable bet for a long-term project. This is where the story shifts from a problem to an inevitability. When you remove the unworkable options, GCAP, with its clear service entry target of 2035 and its proven model of multinational cooperation between the UK, Japan, and Italy, doesn't just look like the best choice. It emerges as the only structurally sound, viable pathway for Canada's long-term sovereign defense. On paper, it is the perfect, clean, engineering-driven explanation. But this logical necessity, as valid as it is, also provides convenient cover for the real, politically fraught reason Canada had to look so far beyond its traditional protector. It allows us to neatly sidestep the elephant in the room, the fundamental shift in our relationship with the one ally we've always counted on. That shift, that elephant in the room, has a name: Washington. For the first time in nearly a century, Ottawa's strategic calculus is being forced to account for the unpredictability of its single most important partner. This isn't about one tweet or one administration. This is about a pattern of sustained economic pressure. It started with the noisy headline-grabbing moves. The Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum landed like a shockwave, treating a core ally's industrial base as a national security threat. It was a clear signal. But behind those headlines, the pressure became more systemic, aimed at the very architecture of our domestic economy. Quiet grievances were filed against Canada's supply management system, for dairy, our pharmaceutical pricing policies, and even our government procurement rules. Each dispute, each negotiation became another point of friction, creating a climate of constant, low-grade conflict. And now, the entire foundation of our continental trade, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement itself, has a ticking clock. A mandatory review is scheduled for July 2026, and that date hangs over every long-term investment decision made in this country. It effectively puts our entire economic model on a deadline. This is where the story shifts. While the media focused on these public trade spats, a deeper, quieter realignment was happening behind the scenes. This isn't my interpretation. Reporting from the Financial Times confirms it, quoting Canadian officials who explicitly link the pursuit of GCAP to efforts to diversify defense ties and economic relations beyond the United States. It was the polite, diplomatic way of saying the quiet part out loud. The risk of depending on a single, increasingly volatile partner had become too high. This sustained pressure is the fundamental reason Canada was forced to seek strategic diversification, to begin building a new framework with other stable, like-minded middle powers like Japan, the UK, and Italy. This move forces a profound question on all of us. For decades, Canada's strategic world began and ended in Washington. That is now changing. Is this pivot a necessary risk to secure our long-term sovereignty, or is it a dangerous gamble with our closest partner? I'm genuinely interested to read your perspective on the strategic dilemma in the comments, because there are no easy answers. But for policymakers in Ottawa, the question is even more immediate. If the very foundation of the last 70 years of North American security is showing deep cracks, what does building a new one actually look like? It is a question of national sovereignty that another Western leader faced under almost identical circumstances decades ago. His own country was being locked out of its dominant allies' inner circle on a critical defense project. His response was so bold, so decisive, that it redrew the strategic map of Europe for a generation. His name was Charles de Gaulle. And understanding his playbook is the key to grasping the sheer scale of the game Canada is now forced to play. So what does that playbook look like? To understand it, we have to travel back to the France of 1966. The Second World War is over, but its shadow still looms large. On the surface, France is a key member of the victorious Western Alliance, a central pillar of NATO. But in the private corridors of the Élysée Palace, President Charles de Gaulle sees a different reality. He sees a nation whose sovereignty is being quietly, methodically eroded by the very structure designed to protect it. American troops are permanently stationed on French soil. American commanders dictate NATO strategy. In a world of two superpowers, France, he feels, is becoming a strategic dependency, not a sovereign partner. He understood that true sovereignty requires the capacity to say no. And for years, the alliance had grown accustomed to a French yes. That was about to change. The moment of decision came on March 7th, 1966. On that day, a formal letter was dispatched from Paris to Washington, landing on the desk of U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson. It was a diplomatic thunderclap. It announced France's complete withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command, and it demanded that all foreign forces and headquarters be removed from French territory within 1 year. The shockwave was immediate. Allies were stunned. Washington was furious. How could a founding member take such a radical step? But de Gaulle was immovable. In his own words, delivered with the cold clarity of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome, he declared that France was, and I quote, determined to regain on her whole territory the full exercise of her sovereignty, to cease her participation in the integrated commands, and no longer to place her forces at the disposal of NATO. There was no room for negotiation in that statement. It was a declaration of strategic independence. And it worked. By 1967, the sprawling NATO headquarters had relocated from Paris to Brussels. The last American soldier had departed French soil. France remained a political member of the Atlantic Alliance, but it now operated on its own terms, free to build its own defense policy and its own nuclear deterrent. It wasn't an act of betrayal, it was a successful, calculated assertion of autonomy. A demonstration that a trusted ally could, and sometimes must, choose to build its own sovereign architecture. But here is where the story truly shifts. Because if you think this historical parallel is just about geopolitical positioning or national pride, you're only seeing the surface of the game. De Gaulle's move wasn't just about soldiers and maps. It was about securing France's industrial and technological destiny. And that is the unspoken prize at the heart of Canada's GCAP decision. It's a prize far more valuable and far more critical to our long-term prosperity than any fighter jet. So what does this industrial destiny we just talked about actually look like on paper? To see the full 50-year picture, you have to look past the jets and the politics and see the blueprint for Canada's future industry. This isn't a happy accident. It's a deliberate, multi-layered strategy. We are witnessing the fusion of defense procurement with a new industrial doctrine. The core claim is this: Canada's entry into GCAP is not primarily a defense purchase. It's an economic accelerator designed from day one to fundamentally change how our country builds wealth and capability. The real question is not what jet we're buying, but what kind of industrial role we are buying into. Under the old model, like our participation in the FF-35 program, Canadian firms acted largely as component suppliers. We build excellent parts, but we don't own the core intellectual property, the architectural design. GCAP offers a completely different path. It's the path to becoming a co-developer. As the defense policy expert Philippe Lagacé at Carleton University notes, this project could be a catalyst for Canada to develop deep domestic know-how on fighter technology. This means our contractors aren't just supplying widgets. They're co-creating the high-value systems and capturing the intellectual property that comes with it. Wait, before we move on to the policy framework, and I know how dry that can sound, I need you to grasp this distinction. This is not just government jargon. This is the switch that determines whether billions of our tax dollars build generational prosperity and sovereign capability in Canada, or simply create more jobs in Texas and Italy. Get this next detail wrong, and the entire advantage of GCAP evaporates. The mechanism that flips that switch is a new doctrine at the heart of our official defense industrial strategy, a framework called Build, Partner, Buy. It's a hierarchy of priorities. For decades, the default was simply to buy off the shelf. This new policy mandates that the government first try to build a capability at home. If that's not possible, the next priority is to partner with trusted allies to co-develop and co-produce it. Buying from others is now the last resort. The strategy explicitly states that this approach will reinforce our sovereign control and create prosperity by directing this joint work back towards Canadian industry. GCAP is the first major test of this doctrine on a global scale. This reframes the entire logic of a project from a pure cost to a long-term investment. Even Canada's initial observer status is designed to begin delivering research and development benefits directly to Canadian aerospace firms. The potential is for those benefits in areas like advanced materials, AI-driven mission systems, and sensor fusion to then cascade back into our broader high-tech economy, strengthening our national competitiveness for decades. It's about planting an orchard, not just buying the fruit. So, by layering this industrial strategy underneath its geopolitical and military moves, Canada is playing a far more sophisticated game. It's about using a single calculated decision to secure a position in the future. But what exactly is that position? This complex strategy secures two critical, long-term advantages for Canada on the global chessboard of the 2040s and beyond. And understanding those two advantages is the key to understanding the entire plan. The first of these advantages becomes clear when we step onto the strategic chessboard of the 2040s. It's about pure operational flexibility. Picture the world in 2 decades. By deliberately cultivating a two-fleet air force, operating both American F-35s and the next-generation GCAP fighter, Canada insulates itself from the immense pressure of a single supplier. This isn't just a theoretical risk. As analysis in publications like the Financial Times and National Interest has highlighted, there are growing concerns in allied nations about potential U.S. control over the F-35's long-term sustainment, its parts, and even its operational readiness through software. By the 2040s, having a credible non-U.S. alternative means Canada cannot be strategically held hostage by export controls or geopolitical leverage from a single dominant partner. It ensures Canadian sovereignty has wings. The second long-term advantage is industrial optionality. This goes far beyond simply building parts for someone else's design. The industrial base that Canada will cultivate through its partnership in GCAP creates a resilient, innovative, and export-capable sector. This is the explicit goal of Canada's own defense industrial strategy, which frames these kinds of international partnerships as essential for achieving strategic autonomy and resilience in the event of a conflict or supply chain fracture. And this is where today's seemingly small step, securing observer status, quietly compounds into massive strategic leverage 2 decades from now. It builds an ecosystem of expertise in AI, advanced materials, and sensor technology that has commercial applications far beyond defense, supporting a broader national vision of a high-tech economy that is not wholly dependent on the U.S. industrial complex. So when you combine this operational flexibility with industrial optionality, the ultimate endgame comes into focus. This was never just about acquiring a new fighter jet. The ultimate goal is the construction of national resilience for a far more fragmented and unpredictable future. It's about having choices when others have none. This long-term thinking, this quiet architectural work of building in options and resilience is the very heart of Canada's sovereign realignment. This entire strategic shift inevitably leads to one final crucial question. What does this all mean for Canada's relationship with the United States right now? And the answer to that requires understanding a critical distinction. This is about strategic diversification, not a strategic divorce. And what that really means is simple maturity. It's the difference between a dependent relationship and a partnership of equals. For decades, the North American security architecture was built on a single powerful pillar. It was strong, it was reliable, but it was still just one. What we're witnessing now is Canada making a deliberate choice to build a second, and maybe even a third pillar, not because the first one is failing, but because any smart architect knows that true stability comes from redundancy. This entire journey, from questioning total reliance on one aircraft to embracing the Global Combat Air Program, was never about rejecting an ally. It was about securing operational flexibility, the freedom to act when our sovereign interests demand it. It was about achieving industrial optionality, a high-tech ecosystem that can thrive on its own terms. It is the long-term strategic payoff of a sober national policy. And this is where the story truly scales. This is not just a Canadian story. Look at the partners in this venture. Japan, the United Kingdom, Italy. They are all established middle powers, all traditionally close allies of the United States, and they are all quietly doing the same thing. They're building new flexible networks, a web of alliances designed for a multipolar world where no single power can or should be the sole anchor. It's not about abandoning the old system. It's about adding resilience to it. It's simply smart risk management on a global scale. When we pull the lens back, the real picture becomes clear. The story of Canada's pivot is a sign of our times. The nations that will thrive in the coming decades won't be those who cling to the old map, but those who are brave enough to draw a new one. This strategic story is still unfolding. If you believe understanding these deep currents is essential, subscribe and join the conversation as we continue to track the moves on this global chessboard.